Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Lunchtime Discovery Series. I'm your host, Chris Smith. I work here at the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences in downtown Raleigh. It's good to be with you all again for another edition of the Lunchtime Discovery Series, where we get to meet some interesting people doing interesting work here in fields like science, nature, conservation, and education all across the state of North Carolina. And this is a great program, especially to be bringing to you virtually like we do these days, because now, wherever you are in the state of North Carolina and beyond, you can learn about some of the fantastic work that people are doing right here in the state and get advice, tidbits, knowledge to take with you into your daily life and into your work. Especially if you're joining us, and you happen to be engaged in work like science, nature, conservation, or environmental education, which I do believe a lot of our audience are. Or maybe you're a school teacher or a school classroom sitting in and you see a topic like, rattlesnakes on the docket. And that just sounds like something cool to learn about. That's what we do right here every week, Wednesdays at noon with the Lunchtime Discovery Series. Of course, today's going to be no different. Our program every week is brought to you by the North Carolina Office of Environmental Education within the Department of Environmental Quality. Many thanks to them for their help in bringing this presentation together every week and getting the word out. And it's a broadcast service of the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences. But today we're bringing lots of different government groups together for this presentation because our guest, Jeff Hall, is a biologist with the North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission. He works as part of the Partners in Amphibian and Reptile Conservation Program, or PARC, P-A-R-C, and Jeff joins us now. Hi, Jeff.
Hey, Chris. How are you today?
I'm doing pretty great. Any day learning about North Carolina's wildlife is a good day.
Awesome. Well, welcome, everybody. I'm really glad that you've chosen to tune in and take a peek into the world of rattlesnakes. Just give me a moment here. I'm going to share my screen. So I do want to talk about rattlesnakes and you, of course, and we'll dive right in. As Chris said, I do work with the North Carolina Wildlife Resources Commission as a biologist there. Here's a cute little neonate or young of the year snake, a snake that was born in a given year. Let's see. There we go. As he mentioned, I do help coordinate the North Carolina chapter of Partners in Amphibian and Reptile Conservation, or NCPARC. If you'd like to learn more about that, you can certainly go check out this website and you can learn more there. So North Carolina has a lot of reptiles and amphibians, or the study of herpetology would include both of those groups of animals. So a lot of times you'll hear herpetologists shorten that word to herps or herp. So North Carolina herp diversity, you see lots of different species here. And then at the end, 38 species of snakes, and 6 of those are venomous. So we're going to talk about some of those today. So some of these are the 6 species that we have in our state. The copperhead is is the most common one that we have all across the state. The cottonmouth, or sometimes called water moccasin, mostly found in the southeastern part of the state. The coral snake, which is one of our rarest snakes, probably the rarest snake, only in the extreme southeast part of the state. And then 3 rattlesnakes, the timber rattlesnake, the pygmy rattlesnake, and the eastern diamondback rattlesnake. And those are the ones that we're going to focus on a little bit more today. How do we identify venomous snakes? Well, there are lots of different tools that we can use when we're trying to figure out which species are out there. But a lot of times, things that we learn aren't necessarily helpful. All snakes have teeth. It's only that venomous snakes have enlarged hollow teeth, as you can kind of see on the left side here. The teeth of this cottonmouth, the fangs rather, are actually inside these little sheaths here, so you can't see them, but they would just poke right through those sheaths if they were attempting to try to bite. This black racer all over here is a harmless, non-venomous species. He's just trying to protect himself. And so you'll see that sort of same gaping behavior from multiple species, not just one species or another. Sometimes looking at scales of snakes can help you identify one from the other. Keeled scales have that raised line down the middle of the scale, as you see on the pictures on the right. And although those two skin patterns look sort of similar in terms of coloration, the one on the left is actually an anaconda, and the one on the right is an eastern diamondback rattlesnake. So keels or no keels makes a big difference. 5 of our 6 venomous species in North Carolina have keeled scales, which includes all 3 of the rattlesnakes. They all have keeled scales. All 5 of our pit vipers do have that heat sensory pit. I often tell people, if that's what you're using to identify whether it's venomous or not, you're way too close. But it does exist. It is there, and it helps them to sense heat that is around them. Also, there are differences underneath the tail of our 5 pit vipers. The coral snake, again, it ends up being an exception to several of these rules, but it's so rare most of the time, it's not one that people usually think about a lot. But in the case of the cottonmouth and the copperhead, you would have a single row of belly scales transitioning to a single row under the tail. The same with all 3 of our rattlesnake species, although you can see it's not always completely exactly the same. You may get a couple like you have here. But with our non-venomous species, you're going to have a single row of belly scales that then switches to a double row of scales under the tail. This can be helpful if you find a shed skin somewhere. You can identify whether that snake is venomous or not just by looking at the shed that you have. But you have to have that tail section. As you see, all 3 of these figures here show that the belly scales are always a single row. So you have to have this section here, which is the vent or cloaca of the animal, which tells you where the tail starts. So if you have the complete skin, you can look at that and tell if it's venomous or not. There are lots of different myths that people have about venomous snakes, and they get all sorts of confusing. So that first one is, well, they have elliptical pupils, right? Well, similar to the heat sensing pit, if you have to be close enough to see if it has an elliptical pupil or not, it's probably not a good idea. However, any of you that may have cats out there, you might have noticed if you leave your cat outside for a good long while and your cat comes back inside, it may have round pupils for a moment before it's able to shrink back down based on the light that it's engaging with. And if you look at the pictures along the bottom here, these are all 6 or 5 different venomous species. These don't all occur in North Carolina. This is the copperhead, which does, and the diamondback, which does. All of these animals look like they have round pupils, and that's because they've been in the light, in dark situations. So there hasn't been enough light, which has caused that pupil to dilate open. It's also true that there are venomous snakes in the world, like this cobra, that have round pupils. And there are non-venomous species, like this emerald tree boa, that have elliptical pupils that aren't venomous. So elliptical pupils is actually an adaptation for nocturnal or nighttime behavior. Triangular head is also one that's complicated. Yes, a lot of our venomous snakes will look like they have a triangular head, including our 3 rattlesnakes, but many of our non-venomous species, which this line I've added in the middle, are all non-venomous. They often will flatten their heads when they're disturbed or afraid, and that will make them look like it's a triangular shaped head as well. So the head, whether it's triangular or not, is probably another one that is not the best way to identify them. So how do we figure out what they are, Jeff? How do we know? Well, it's to become familiar with them, to learn their patterns, learn various aspects of their biology. All those things can help us. Think about familiarity we have with other animals. Can you tell which of these is a dog and which of these is a cat? Of course you can. Immediately you know which one is which. And it's because we have a greater familiarity with some animals like these. So the more familiar we become with snakes around us, the better we become at identifying. One additional feature, of course, that rattlesnakes have is that they do have a rattle on the end of their tails. Now, the rattle is actually made up of sections of shed skins that are actually interlocking. You can kind of see this cross section here shows the inside of what one of these rattles would look like. And each time the snake sheds, it actually pushes the rattle outward. So the newest parts are right here, right next to the tail. The oldest parts are all the way out here at the end of the rattle. So the rattle sort of will extend out each time the snake sheds. You can sometimes get an indication of how old a rattlesnake is by looking at the rattle, but it has to do with how often they shed in a particular year. Because as I said, each segment represents a shed. It doesn't necessarily represent a year. In fact, it rarely represents a single year with one shed. It's usually multiple sheds per year. So let's look at the three species that we have in our state. The timber rattlesnake is a species of special concern. In the coastal plain, it often has more of a reddish stripe down the middle of its back. Whether it's in the coast, the Piedmont, or the mountains, you will generally see these chevron V patterns down the middle of the snake, which can help identify this animal. This is a young of the year down here on the left. So it doesn't have a rattle like you might see from other ones. It just has a little button, just one little piece right at the end of its tail there. So it wouldn't make any sounds if it attempted to rattle. In the mountains, we sometimes get animals that are all black or very melanistic, like this one here and this one down here. We typically don't see those anywhere other than the mountain populations. Or these sort of brightish yellow animals, we also tend to see these more often in the mountain populations. So by this range map here, you can see this is a map that's maintained by the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences. And each one of these solid dots represents a specimen that someone has in a collection somewhere, many of them at our museum, our North Carolina museum, that is. And the hollow circles represent instances where we don't have a specimen, but we have someone that knows what they're talking about that said they had seen it, or a photographic record, things of that nature. But you can see this is, of our three rattlesnakes, the one that has the widest distribution. We do see it in the coastal plain and the mountains, and then there is a couple of little Piedmont populations of this animal, the Uaris, and then sort of this really rare population up here, sort of Granville, Person, Durham County area. The timber rattlesnake is protected, as all three of our rattlesnakes are. The timber rattlesnake is a species of special concern. Our second of three species is the pygmy rattlesnake. You can see it has a much smaller distribution, only found mostly in the coastal plain and sandhills, although there is this little weird population over here near Charlotte. In the outer coastal plain, they tend to have this sort of reddish pinkish coloration, and then more sandhills and further southeast North Carolina, they'll have more of this purpley blue type of coloration. And then our final of our three species is the eastern diamondback rattlesnake. It's the rarest of our three rattlesnake species, and was originally found in 13 counties, as you see down here in the southeast coastal plain, but now mostly is found only in 1 or 2 counties. It does have these nice big diamond patterns down its back. Occasionally, we get folks to get confused between timber rattlesnakes and diamondbacks because they'll see part of the chevron pattern of the timber rattlesnake and confuse it with the diamondback. All of our pit vipers, including our three rattlesnakes, do bear live young. Why does that matter? Well, that has to do with some of the biology of the animal, which is relevant to what we're going to be talking more of what we'll talk about in just a moment. Sites where these animals have to go if they are in locations with cooler temperatures, especially in the mountains, these animals will have to go somewhere where they can maintain warm enough body temperatures to be able to grow those young babies inside their bodies. As I said, these guys are all live bearers, so they are going to give birth late in the year, usually around August or September. And so if they're in mountain locations, they may use an open rocky site like this to gestate those growing embryos. In the coastal plain and much of the Piedmont, a gestation site might just look like this. Nothing particularly interesting or exciting about this. You'll notice there's a log there, so maybe there's a little bit of protection. And at the bottom right of that log, if we zoom in, there is a gravid or pregnant pygmy rattlesnake. 2 days later, she had these 2 babies that you can see hanging out right here. There's one baby there, and that's the mother after she had given birth. So in the coastal plain and Piedmont, it can be kind of tough to find these places sometimes. In the mountains, especially where we have cooler temperatures year round, these animals seek out gaps in the canopy that may allow them to find the right kind of temperatures to be able to stay warm when it's cool or to be cool if it's too hot. Basically trying to find that perfect gradient for maintaining a temperature to grow those embryos. And just here's another example of one. And if you go to those at certain times, you may see females like this. Here's a couple of females that are at this one gestation site. You can see the scales are sort of side by side, which tells us these animals are both sort of distended. Normally the scales on a snake's body overlap by as much as a third or so, but when they're side by side like that, this could be the result of a really large meal item, or in the case of these animals, they've got those growing embryos inside, really causing their bodies to expand out. Eventually, they'll give birth at these sites, and you'll see here's a couple of females and several babies that are hatched, not really hatched, but born from that year. You can see that some of these have not yet shed. They have dark colored eyes, and some of them have clear eyes. So these are really important areas for rattlesnakes. So community science, and how does that tie into this? Well, you know, this is when we really involve the general public in collecting data for scientific efforts. That's a Jeff Hall definition, I guess you might say. And we've got some students here that are assisting in some amphibian research at this location. Why is it important? Well, you can collect lots of observations with lots of different places with many, many more people. There's only one Jeff Hall. As it turns out, there's a lot of Jeffs, but there's only one Jeff Hall. So it can't necessarily go everywhere all the time and look everywhere. So it's really helpful to have more people out there doing the looking. It also can be a really helpful tool for educational outreach, connecting people to the natural world. And it can just help people understand the value of research that people are doing and learn why this teaches us about some of the species that we care about, and hopefully leads to some conservation actions at some point. HertMapper, if you've never heard of it, you might try going to hertmapper.org another time, not right now. It's a really, really valuable tool for people to be able to enter records of animals that they find. Right now, there are over 31,000 observations just in North Carolina from people just like you that went out and saw a particular reptile or amphibian and uploaded it to this site. This can be really, really valuable for detecting some of these species we're talking about today, the 3 rattlesnakes, or any of our species of greatest conservation need, which is a term that helps the Wildlife Commission decide species of conservation concern within our North Carolina Wildlife Action Plan. So back in 2009, the North Carolina chapter of PARC had the idea that we might really expand our understanding of rattlesnakes by trying to put brochures out at some of the educational events that we were attending, especially the Dixie Deer Classic in Raleigh and other kinds of places where we might go and interact with people that are in the field a lot anyway. Perhaps they could help us get some additional sightings of some of these species. And this is actually based off of a prototype that a friend and colleague of mine, Zach Orr, used to learn more about rattlesnakes in the Uwaris. He produced a similar brochure that he just passed around at gas stations and things like that. And it turned out to be pretty useful for him. So we developed this brochure along those same lines, except in this case, we included all 3 species, included some range maps, some natural history information, some other identifying pieces to it. And we started handing these out. The critical pieces from this brochure are the parts where we want to know, we need a photo, we want the name of the person, we want to know exactly where they were and when they were there, and then we need the coordinates. It's funny, the sightings that we get from people, sometimes they won't have one of these pieces, like maybe they don't say where they are, and I'll reply back, can you tell me what your location is? And sometimes, it comes back with my backyard. And I'm thinking, I need to be better at communicating what I mean when I say location. So we've added all these pieces into our brochure now to hopefully help with those sorts of things. So when people go out, they have to look for things, right? And sometimes rattlesnakes can be pretty tough to see. There's one in the middle of this photo. I'll zoom in a little bit. Now you can probably see him a little bit more clearly, coiled up right in the middle in this pile of leaves. So once people see that rattlesnake, if they take a photo of it, they can then upload that to either HertMapper or send it to us, and then we can learn more about what these animals are doing. We have been getting some amazing information from some of our observers. This is one that was sent in. This is a rattlesnake that is in ambush mode, and that means it is attempting to have a predation event where it's going to try to eat something. So a lot of times rattlesnakes will put their heads or part of their body along the edge of a log, waiting for some rodent or other prey item to run along this log, and then they would grab it as it goes along, envenomate it, and then follow it to actually eat the animal. So it's really amazing and awesome when we get pictures like this depicting interesting behaviors. Here's another one, another snake that's in ambush posture. A little more difficult to see this one, but you can see this snake has its head resting right on this log, waiting for some unsuspecting rodent to come running along. It also teaches us, by the way, if you're going to step over a log and you're in rattlesnake country, you might look on the other side of that log before you take that step. Just keep yourself aware. Sometimes the tables get turned on rattlesnakes. This is one that is being predated itself by an eastern king snake. This was sent to a forester from the coastal plain in 2014. So really, really super cool information that we're getting from various folks. Did you know that rattlesnakes sometimes can climb? They certainly can. They're not really going to be climbing, a normal large tree. They're not going to just be able to go up the trunk of a tree like, say, a rat snake or some other species can. But if there are shrubs that are sort of touching the ground or close to the ground, and there's a network of branches that they can use to climb up, they will do so. These two photos were sent in by one of our community science folks with location information to tell us about this particular animal. Here's another one. Now this one's a little more tough to see, but there's a rattlesnake right here in the middle of this rhododendron bush that's about 5 feet off the ground. So they can climb up into low-lying vegetation like that. So what does this mean? What kinds of records are we getting from people? I'm showing you some of these observations. How many of these types of records are we really getting, right? Lots of really cool stuff. And by the way, here's one that the juvenile has a hold of a juvenile cottontail rabbit, which is really, really pretty cool. In 2020, we got more than 100 sightings sent in from this brochure. Those 100 sightings yielded 70 that were actually rattlesnakes. So what do I mean by that? Well, some of them, it says rattlesnake, but then you look at the photo and it might actually be a water snake or some other species. So they aren't absolutely all rattlesnakes that come into us. But we were amazed by this because I mentioned to you, you might remember that we produced this brochure in 2009. Well, from 2009 through 2019, I got 2 records sent to me over all of those years. But enter COVID and people wanting to get outdoors a little bit more because they were a little bit feeling trapped. At least this is my thinking on it. We ended up having a lot more people outside. This brochure got shared a little bit more maybe than it would have been before. And we really had lots and lots more records. Before going into the season for 2021, we did create a new email address to make it easier for people to send us in sightings, rattlesnake@ncwildlife.org. We updated that brochure, which you saw the updated version there, which is available on the Wildlife Commission website as well as other places too. And we sent out a number of different press releases so folks would be aware and kind of know what to look for. So how did 2021 shape up? Very similarly, lots of rattlesnake pictures coming in. And one of the things that we really love about this project is the vast majority of these snakes are live. They're snakes that people are seeing and encountering in the wild, and they're sending us records of these animals. And notice here, I've mostly shown you timber rattlesnakes, but we have gotten some pygmy rattlesnake records in as well. No diamondback records just yet, but we're holding on hope that we may eventually one day get a diamondback record as well. So what was the summary for 2021? You won't believe it. more than 300 sightings sent in by people all across the state. And that resulted in it's actually more than that, resulting in over 245 rattlesnake records. So again, some of those were not rattlesnakes, even though they were sent into us that way. But that is really amazing. There's no way I'd be able to generate that many sightings in a year, even using all the Wildlife Commission staff. If everybody was dedicated to just going and looking for rattlesnakes and nothing else, maybe we'd get that many, but I'm not even sure that would work. So this is just an amazing multiplier for us to be able to learn about what's going on. And I'll say this about our observers that are out there. They're very good at what they're doing. So notice in 2021, 77% of those records identified correctly. And then in 2022, this should be 2020 and 2021. We're just now in 2022. But those 2021 records, 80% of them correctly identified. So really, really good work by all of you out there. It just means we have folks that know what they're looking at. And not only are we getting some of these general locations, but I mentioned to you some biological information about why gestation sites might be really important, especially for montane populations. In fact, many of those populations are limited by places that they may have open canopy gap places where they can grow those babies. Those gravid females have to find these spots. Well, a number of our records that we've received from the public have included places that were new to us that we didn't know about already. And so we've gone and ground truthed a number of these sites. So we would take the coordinates and go to those locations and see, does this look like it's a place that might be important for gravid females that might be having babies. And so you can see the one on the left there, there's two animals underneath the rock. This is absolutely a gravid female with all those scales side by side. This one may not be, but again, an important site there. And here's another gravid female sitting up on top of a rock. This kind of stuff just is so exciting to me because it helps us know about another area, another potential population of snakes, another area where we can look into what conservation measures we can put into place. Here's a different gestation site. Here we have two different females, and there's actually a third one underneath this rock here. Really, really exciting stuff. Here's two adults underneath the rock, a yellow phase adult and a dark phase adult over here. Here's a yellow adult underneath the rock. And here's one that was peering right back at me when I was trying to look underneath there with my flashlight and mirror. I will note that at these kinds of places, whenever we go and if we see that there are snakes there, we usually try to move away from these sites as soon as we detect the animals there, because these are places that these females need to be doing what they're doing. They, as my friend John Seeley likes to say, they're up to important snake business. And so we don't want to interrupt that important snake business. And in this case, those days that the females have to lay out in the sun and grow those babies are really, really important. So I don't want to scare those animals back under the rock or cause them to change their behavior, things like that. So when we see these sites, we try to get out of there as soon as we can once we learn that there are, in fact, females in the area, or that it's a site that's one we want to keep track of for the future. Oh, one additional piece. So we did suggest that people go to HertMapper and upload their records. And it turns out that lots of folks did that in addition to records that we received directly. So this does not include any records that we received directly. Now, again, in our timeline, remember, we created our brochure in 2009. So we didn't have a whole lot of success here early on. A few people were putting in some records in HertMapper. I would say this has nothing to do with our brochure. This is just folks learning more about the vehicle that is HertMapper and learning how to add their records. But then you see a spike in 2020 and then a really powerful spike in 2021, 247 on top of the over 300 records that we received. So we're looking at 500 some records that were generated in 2021. Just really, really fantastic, awesome stuff. I will just mention one last little piece, that sometimes trail cameras can be used and sometimes can also give us information about snakes in some of these areas. And so sometimes if we go to one of these areas that seems important for snakes, but we don't see any, or we're not sure how important it is for a particular site, we may set up one of these trail cameras. And this is what it looks like after it's deployed on the tree and it's focused at a spot that we think might be valuable for snakes. And then when we go back and look at these photos later on, we may, in fact, actually get a rattlesnake on the camera that we wouldn't have gotten through any other methodology. So there's a young timber rattlesnake in that image, and there's another one down there in the bottom left. So sometimes trail cameras can be another really valuable tool for us as well. Future work. Well, we definitely want to continue promoting these records. They are really, really fantastic and give us much more knowledge about populations that we have in the state. And if we learn more about where populations are, then like I've said several times, we can enact conservation measures to try to save those populations or conserve those populations. We'll continue ground truthing those sites that seem like they're really, really important for one reason or another. And then this final piece, this is going to take a while, but it's looking at each one of those populations. How many records do we have in a particular area? And looking at what are the threats to each of those populations and what are things that we can do to abate those threats. And all of this is really made much more possible through efforts of community science records that we receive. There are some good websites out there to help with identification if that's something that you would still like help with. I personally like this one. It's supported by the NCPARC group, but it's herpsofnc.org. So you can check that one out. It's basically an online field guide. And if you click on the snakes tab, you'll notice that there's a thumbnail for every species that occurs in the state. And then if you click on that thumbnail of the snake or the name of the snake, then you'll get some more information about where it lives. You'll have a range map, all of that kind of good information that can help you with your own identification into the future. And as I've mentioned already several times, this work is not possible without you. This is where the you really comes in. If you happen to see one of the 3 rattlesnakes, or for that matter, any reptiles or amphibians, you can document those using this Herp Mapper app, and that will help us learn about where some of these animals are. If you prefer to not do that, you can still continue to send those to the rattlesnake at ncwildlife.org, or heck, you can just send them directly to me, jeff.hall@ncwildlife.org. So you've got some choices. Some of you may be familiar with the Carolina Herp Atlas, which is down here at the bottom. If you use that as well, it is now incorporated as part of Herp Mapper. So if you prefer to use that, you can, and those records automatically will go into Herp Mapper as well. But you can just go directly to Herp Mapper just as easily. And with that, I would love to take questions. I wanted to try to go on the low side so that if folks have questions, I'll have an opportunity to share them and talk through what some of those things might be. So Chris, are there questions out there?
Yeah, we've definitely got some questions. But first, I want to invite everybody to give you a great big round of applause, because that was a wonderful presentation.
Thank you. Thank you. Appreciate that.
Always love learning about North Carolina's wildlife. And it seems like learning about the rattlesnakes and the other venomous ones is pretty important.
Yeah, the more that we learn about, it's kind of like one of those, the more you know thing. But as with any wildlife observation or biology in general, the more that we learn about a particular thing, the more that we can appreciate it, understand what it needs to be able to survive in our landscape, all those pieces that go along with it.
Now, I'm actually going to take the first question because this is one that I'm thinking about. You mentioned several times using this information to learn where there might be snakes you don't know about yet, or there are populations, or where females are using sites to gestate and give birth. And then you said you can use that information to develop measures to protect and conserve them. what are some of those measures? Like, what would the Resource Commission actually do? You identify a site or population. What sort of proposals or policies then begin to take effect?
Absolutely. That's a great question. So some of the things that we might potentially do are look into if it's a private land that has that particular spot. We might look at working with that landowner to look for what are conservation measures that that landowner may take, or it may be that the landowner doesn't even know those are there, and informing them of that helps them understand the value of that particular site and allows them to make some choices about management actions that may be taken around the site or may not be taken around the site. Trying to make sure, that whatever management is something that could coexist with these animals on the landscape. There may be opportunities where if we learn about a piece of land that's also in private ownership, that we may be able to acquire that property. It may be that we look into purchasing it and acquiring it for the commission so that we can continue managing it into the future. It may be that it's already on a piece of public land. And many times, if it's a piece of public land, like let's say it's a North Carolina Wildlife Commission game land, or maybe it's a state park, or maybe it is a U.S. Forest Service land. If it's one of those types of places, then it can help us work with whatever that entity is to say, okay, just know that in this particular area, this compartment, there's this important area that you want to be aware of whenever you're doing whatever actions may be involved. Let's say a new road needs to go through an area, or a new campground, or insert the different type of activity that might need to go into a particular area. If we know that there are places like this, it can help us alter those types of things, or sometimes say, well, it's probably not a really good idea to put a campsite right next to a known spot where we're going to see lots of rattlesnakes every year. That doesn't seem like the best place. So those kinds of conversations can take place if we know about where these things are on the landscape. Whereas if we don't know, sometimes we can maybe make the best decisions in terms of trying to minimize, human rattlesnake encounters, and really sometimes not necessarily work for the positive conservation of the animals.
Excellent stuff. Thank you.
Yeah.
All right, folks. There are lots of questions coming up in the chat here now. We've got lots of time, so if you've got thoughts and questions, drop them in the chat for us, and that's where I'm going to go now. The first one that came up was from Glenn, who's curious how many, the number of baby snakes that are born usually.
Great question. It does vary a little bit by the size of the adult, but generally it can be anywhere from about 5 to say maybe 13, 14, 15 would be a fairly large litter. So generally there's somewhere in the neighborhood of 8 to 12 neonates or young that are born from one particular female. Good question.
Okay, so that the picture we saw 2 neonates. Do you think that was just 2 that were just hanging out of possibly 8 or more?
Yes, exactly right. I think there was probably more as a part of that litter. Mm-hmm.
All right, Stacy has the next question here. Let's see. If we participate in the Box Turtle Connection project, should we also be adding to Herp Mapper for those sightings?
That's a really good question. Probably don't need to do that because we can get access to those Box Turtle Connection records through the Wildlife Commission application that we use to keep track of that data. So probably don't need to do that. However, folks that aren't participating specifically in the Box Turtle Connection, if you see a box turtle out and about, by all means, it would be valuable to put those records into Herp Mapper. And it may be that you have a particular site that is your Box Turtle Connection project, and some of you don't know what I'm talking about. That's okay. You can look into that if you like. If it's outside of your site that you're taking normal data on, then yeah, that would probably be worth, definitely worth uploading that record to Herp Mapper because it wouldn't be part of your normal Box Turtle Connection information.
And a comment came in that I think was interesting from Krista. And you mentioned Eastern Diamondbacks being listed as a species of special concern in the state. So should folks who are interested in documenting their sightings, maybe using sites like Herp Mapper or the popular app iNaturalist, Should they be considerate of what sightings they upload or which ones they send you because of where they might be located or because they're of special concern or threatened species?
Yeah, really great question, Chris. So first part, both timber rattlesnakes and pygmy rattlesnakes are species of special concern, and diamondbacks
Okay.
are actually endangered in North Carolina. And it is valuable to recognize that these are not locations that we want to share with just everyone everywhere out there. There are people in the world, one, that don't like rattlesnakes, and two, there are people that like them too much, where they want to collect them and illegally, things like that. So how can you protect your records? Well, if you work through that platform, HertMapper, there's a little box, and I would encourage you to use it on sightings of any rare or listed species. There's a little box on there that you can mark it as private. What that means is you're the only person that can see that entry on their website. Now, if you don't mark that as private on their website, when you go, people will see a photo of that animal, but the only information they'll be able to get is the county where the animal is found. So there's already some built-in protections in HertMapper itself. iNaturalist is a different beast altogether. So iNaturalist, and one of the reasons it's a good platform, but it is more difficult for researchers to access some of that data for work that we might want to do. Also, it is not controlled the same way that HertMapper is. There are many species that are automatically obscured, where you put in the information about the animal, and because it is species A or B, then it may have a larger bubble that goes around that dot so that people have a harder time figuring out where it was. But we, as state biologists, don't really have any input into how that's done or how wide that bubble is or things along those lines. So that's really why I generally prefer for people to think about HertMapper for their reptile and amphibian records. But if you do put it in iNaturalist, there is also a section on there where you can mark it as, I can't remember, it might be personal, something like that. So sort of similar to HertMapper, but that then does not make that data available to anyone ever. So that's, kind of the caveat of citizen science or community science, where you want to be able to make the data available to biologists that can do good things with it, while hoping to keep these animals secure and conserved on the landscape. So it's a really good question, and there are things that you can do to keep that secure. And actually, in the end, if you prefer to not be on one of these, you can just send it to us, and that it's not going to be shared on in these kinds of places. So yeah,
right. There you go. Excellent. All right. Let's see. Another viewer is asking if you can repeat the seasons or months when snakes are most likely to be seen and most likely to be at their gestation sites.
Yeah, so which snakes are visible what times of the year varies a little bit by species, but generally speaking, most snakes start coming out of emergence from their hibernation spot sometime around March or April, depending on how high elevation you are. If you're in the coastal plain, there are definitely animals that start coming out of hibernation, sometimes even in late February, early March. If you're at a high elevation in the mountains, you may have snakes that actually don't really come out until mid-April, or maybe even late April, or even early May in some years. So that's going to really be dependent on where you are. But sort of that March, April, May through say maybe October-ish is about when snakes tend to be active. And from those, after they've emerged from their hibernation spots, various snake species, including the rattlesnakes, will basically be dispersing all across the landscape, doing their normal important snake business. So looking for food, looking for eventually mates that they will usually mate in about the fall of the year. So they have about a year cycle from the time that they mate to the time that they give birth. There's a lot of details in there, but generally speaking, rattlesnakes are looking for mates in late July, August, and September. And then those females will give birth that following August or September. So that's usually when those sites are really, really super valuable. Now, for some montane animals, those females, when they come out of hibernation following that breeding event the previous August or September, they're going to start seeking out open canopy types of locations or probably, early June or so. And they're probably going to stay at those places all through the summer, trying to grow those new babies so that they will have successful birthing later in the year, like I'm saying, the August, September timeframe.
All right. Excellent stuff. Good question. Will wants to know, what are some of the most misunderstood things about snakes?
Boy, there's lots of them. I mentioned a couple earlier, where people use head shape, triangular shaped head means it's venomous, stuff like that. Some of my favorites are some of the ones where snakes can sting you with their tails. That one's still out there. Some people believe that. There aren't any stinging snakes, so that's not accurate. Another favorite, there are a couple of species of snakes that are perceived to be part of this, where they can take their tail in their mouths and then actually roll down the hill. Some people may be familiar with the term hoop snake. Well, there is no snake that can do that. Generally speaking, it's either a black racer or something like that myth has sort of come around, or even mud snakes. And I'm not sure exactly what that comes from, but there aren't, in fact, any snakes that can take their tail in their mouth and roll down the road. So that's definitely
a great one
out there. There are lots of myths about snakes and the names that they have. Corn snakes don't eat corn. Milk snakes don't milk from cows. Both of those species are named for associations that they have with places that are good to find rodents, which many snake species exist on various rodent species, and so they might be drawn to places that have corn or where cows are hanging out, because there are rodent populations in those areas. Those are just a few.
Well, I've never heard about tail in the mouth rolling down the hill. That's a good one.
The hoop snake is legendary.
The hoop snake. All right, let's see here. This is a good one. You call it community science, but in years past, it's been called citizen science. Is there a difference, and why do you call it community science?
Yeah, so it's basically the same topic. The difference is, we've learned that in some communities, the term citizen may be somewhat difficult for some individuals. We're not trying to limit this to any one group of people, whoever they are. It's basically a community of anyone that wants to submit a record. Doesn't necessarily have to be, citizens of a particular place or anything like that. I don't think anyone ever thought of that when they came up with that term, citizen science. It's just meant to be a term that is inclusive, but for some, it felt like it was exclusive. And so many folks, including some of the bird groups, as well as other citizen science platforms, I used it right then, have switched and started using that term community science to really be more inclusive of all individuals that may be interested in participating in science.
I do like it better too, because it also, I don't know, a sense of community means more to me if we're talking about getting people engaged and involved in science and scientific research that is around them. Because normally you do, if I'm submitting observations or working on a project like this, it's in my backyard, or it's in the park next to my house, or the public lands that are near me, and it's my observations going in to serve Raleigh or the Triangle or North Carolina, versus this sort of bigger amorphous thing that we think of as citizenry.
Yeah, that is really a fantastic point. And it makes sense too, because we're going to care about the communities that are around us much more than we might the ones that are much further away. And so, I agree wholeheartedly with what you said there, Chris.
All right. Lisa wants to know, do females use gestation areas for many years? Are they inherited?
Yeah, so we'll answer that first one first. Yes, females will often use the same sites over multiple breeding cycles. It is important to note with most rattlesnake species, they don't give birth every year. They may not even give birth every other year. They may not even give a birth every 2 years. So some places it may take 2 to 3 to 4 or even 5 years in between the time that a female gives birth and the next time she gives birth. So you're talking about multiple years in between from one site to the next. So if you go to one particular site and you were to count all the females that were there and you went back the next year, you would likely not see any of the same females at that particular site. So you see some turnover, not turnover. You're just not going to see the same animals every year because, like I say, there's multiple years in between. The cost of producing young and having birth is really, really severe. And so for these animals, they have to build back up their strength. They have to build back up their follicles so that they can then be able to give birth again. And so that usually takes a couple of years at least for most of these species. So that's an important point. Secondarily, how we do see young snakes, juveniles, even ones that aren't necessarily gravid or again pregnant, that show up at some of these areas. So how do they find them? Do they inherit it? Well, no, we don't think that's the case. But snakes are very good at following scent trails. And that is a trail that's left by another snake. And so it turns out several folks have done some work with juvenile rattlesnakes as well as juveniles of other snakes and learned that juveniles will often trail the scent of another individual of that same species. So a young timber rattlesnake comes across a scent of maybe a female rattlesnake in the woods. He may follow that scent and it may draw him or her to a new a spot that they hadn't been before. So they do use cues in their environment, left by other individuals of the same species. It's pretty fascinating stuff.
Interesting.
The more you dig into it, absolutely.
Yeah, that's really interesting stuff. But I am going to go on to another question here for you. Anthony was curious, were any of the new county records reported? Hold on, let me get it right. Were any of the new county records that you got, were they new records, like new sightings in new places, or were they validations of places you knew snakes already were at?
I don't believe that we ended up with any county records where, there was no record in that county before. I don't believe we ended up with any records like that. We certainly did end up with many records, sort of, as he says, validating previous historical records from an area. But we also did get a number of records, many records, from locations within counties where we knew there were snakes, but didn't know about that particular area. And as I mentioned several times, there are multiple spots that are of particular importance, these open canopy types of sites that we didn't know were there, these gestation sites that we were led to through these records. So those were really, really super valuable, and we wouldn't have found them just on our own. Well, maybe some of them we would have found, but like I say, our ability to know what's out there is just so massively increased by the help of communities around the state.
Excellent stuff. Would the WRAC mail out stacks of the Rattlesnake Wanted brochures? How do you get those?
Possibly. Yeah, I guess it depends on what constitutes a stack. Yeah, you can send, I'm not sure what that person is exactly talking about, but if you have a need or a want for a place that maybe you would either want to display that or something along those lines, you can send me an email and ask for that. And again, somebody can post my email in the YouTube chat if they want to, but it's jeff.hall@ncwildlife.org. So you can send me a note about that and I can look into that. Alternatively, that PDF that has a fillable form on it is available online, and I can easily send you the link for that as well. And you can pass that around electronically, and you can actually use that to submit records as well.
All right. At what age do rattlesnakes reach reproductive maturity, and how many litters might they have over a lifetime?
Yeah, those are awesome questions. They're really getting to the heart of biology of a lot of these animals. So timber rattlesnakes and pygmy rattlesnakes and diamondbacks mature a little bit differently, but I'll mainly talk about timbers because they're the one that people are most likely to encounter. Timber rattlesnakes generally reach maturity somewhere between 6 to 8 years of age. So what we would say is somewhat late. Some really high elevation animals may even be a little bit older than that before they reach maturity. So that's when they actually reach sexual maturity. They may not have their first litter as a female for then maybe another couple of years. And then we know that they're going to have, maybe 2, 3, 4 years in between that, from that litter to the next litter to the next litter. So there are a number of snakes that may only have 2 to 3 litters over the lifespan of their life. Timber rattlesnakes can live 15 to 20 years or even longer in the wild, but there are plenty of things out there. I like to say it's a jungle out there. There's lots of things that want to eat you, even if you are a nice big venomous snake. It's a challenge, but it's probably not too far-fetched to say that many females may only have 2, 3 litters over the course of their lifespan, and some of them may only have 1. Pygmy rattlesnakes mature a little bit more quickly, and so they may, but they don't live quite as long, so it may be the same in terms of litters. Diamondbacks, it's relatively the same as timber rattlesnakes, although there may be a litter more frequently than what you get with timbers, especially if you're talking timber rattlesnakes at those higher elevation sites.
Great questions, everybody. Looking at the clock, I think we've got time for just one more, maybe 2 more. I see 2 more here. Are rattlesnakes territorial?
It depends on what you mean by territorial. They do set up home ranges where they are in an area that's known to them, but they aren't necessarily going to fight with others that are in that same home range. So you can have multiple individuals overlapping in that same home range area. There is one time of the year where you may actually experience some combat, male-male combat may occur at the time of the year when breeding is occurring. And so if there's a female that is gravid and she is ready to breed with a male, it's possible at that time that if there are multiple males that encounter one another right in the same spot where that female is, they may actually engage in combat. But other than that, they're not going to necessarily be territorial in any other way. But like I say, they do know their landscapes, and it is important to note that when we find rattlesnakes on the landscape, they need to be left where they are, because the places that they are familiar with are really important to them. And if you move them into another area, they won't know where they are. One, all the rattlesnake species are protected, so you shouldn't be moving them anyway. But if you were to move them outside of that home range, they have very, very high rates of mortality because they don't survive. They don't know the special spots to get. They don't know where the McRodent is in that particular patch of woods, and they don't know where the holes in the ground are that are good to survive the winter. There's so many things that are challenging for rattlesnakes to begin with. And so their home range, where they live, is really, really important to them. Just as it is for any of us. If you took me outside of Greenville, where I live, and put me in a different city, I'd have to learn what I have to do there to be able to survive. So anyway, it's really important that they stay in those same areas. But you can have many home ranges overlapping of multiple snakes.
All right, that's a good one. And the last question then, and it's right at 1 o'clock, which I don't know. It's a good one to end on, but I don't know how much time we've got for this one. Jay Reynolds is wanting to know how you got interested in herps, reptiles and amphibians.
You know what? There's a couple of short things I can share so that we don't go too long. Probably the very first encounter that I had with a reptile or amphibian, I was living in Raleigh as a kid, and I was about probably 4 or 5 years old. I was playing around in the backyard, and there was an eastern garter snake that had a hold of a toad, and it had a hold of it from the rear. And so the toad was sort of sticking, its front legs and its mouth and its head were kind of sticking out of the mouth of this garter snake. And I was just amazed, repulsed, horrified, and excited all at the same time. I didn't know what to do. So, I kind of jumped up and down, and the garter snake let go of the toad, and the toad hopped away, and the garter snake went away. And I thought, man, this is the most amazing thing I've ever seen. And I think from that day forward, I always paid attention to things that were out on the ground. The things that were on the ground were always the most interesting to me. I love to get in creeks and flip rocks and look for salamanders and crayfish and things like that. And so the things that are alive in the world always just held great fascination for me. Both of my parents were very interested in nature and being outdoors. And so that is another piece that probably helped instill in me an appreciation for the natural world.
That's a great story. I love that. That's fantastic. And that is a great way to go out on the program. Jeff, thanks for being with us today and sharing all of your great information and knowledge about North Carolina's wildlife with us.
Thank you for having me, Chris. It's been a privilege.
That was fun. We had a great big crowd and lots of friends of snakes, which is great to see. I had even, I posted a poll in the YouTube chat asking if anyone had ever seen wild rattlesnakes, like live wild rattlesnakes. And 2/3 of our viewers or people who responded to that poll said that they have. So that's pretty cool. I've not seen a living wild rattlesnake in the wild yet. So that's pretty special.
That is really, really fantastic.
So everybody, thank you for being a part of today's presentation, for your thoughts and questions in the chat. We will, of course, be back here again next week with another edition of the Lunchtime Discovery Series, Wednesdays at noon. Make sure that you tune in all next month, too. It'll be the month of February, and the program will be celebrating Black History Month. Make sure that you're following the Office of Environmental Education on social media. They're at North Carolina EE on Twitter. You can go to their website, eenorthcarolina.org, and there you can find the full lineup for the month of February. We've got some really exciting programs coming up next month. I'm very excited for them. I think they're going to be great. So make sure that you bookmark those and come back and tune in right here at the museum's YouTube channel for another edition of the program. Until next time, everybody, continue to take care, stay safe, keep your community safe, and get out there and do some fun science while you're at it. And we'll see you again next week. Bye, everybody.